Today on Bench Briefs, we're looking at a fascinating Supreme Court of Canada decision from 1995 called Miron v. Trudel. This case dives into the complex intersection of insurance law and constitutional rights, particularly focusing on equality under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, what happened in Miron v. Trudel? The story begins with an unfortunate motor vehicle accident in Quebec. The plaintiff, Mr. Miron, was injured when the defendant, Mr. Trudel, caused the crash. Naturally, Miron sought damages to cover his injuries and losses, but Quebec's automobile insurance law had a catch. It set limits on the types of damages victims could claim, and these limits varied depending on the nature of the injuries. In other words, if your injuries were considered serious enough, you could claim more compensation. If not, your recovery was capped. This raised a big question. Was it fair to treat accident victims differently based on how serious their injuries were? Miron argued that these statutory limits discriminated against him and others with less severe injuries, denying them equal protection under the law. He claimed this went against Section 15(1) of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees equality rights and protection against discrimination. The legal issue before the Supreme Court was twofold. First, did the Quebec insurance scheme's limits on damages violate the equality rights guaranteed by Section 15(1) of the Charter? And second, if they did, could the infringement be justified under Section 1 of the Charter, which allows reasonable limits on rights if they can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society? The court's analysis was nuanced. Section 15(1) protects individuals from discrimination based on certain grounds, including physical disability. The insurance scheme created a distinction between victims with serious injuries and those with less serious ones, effectively treating them differently in terms of compensation. The court recognized that this distinction had the potential to perpetuate disadvantage for those with less severe injuries, who might still face significant challenges but were limited in their ability to recover damages. However, the court also considered the purpose behind the statutory limits. Quebec's automobile insurance system aimed to balance fairness to victims with the broader public interest of controlling insurance costs and ensuring access to coverage for all drivers. The limits were designed to provide a predictable and affordable insurance framework. In the end, the Supreme Court found that the statutory limits did infringe on the equality rights of accident victims under Section 15(1). But importantly, the court also held that this infringement was justified under Section 1 of the Charter because the limits served a pressing and substantial objective and were rationally connected to that goal. The scheme struck a reasonable balance between individual rights and societal interests. Why does Miron v. Trudel matter? This case is a key example of how courts navigate the tricky terrain between protecting constitutional rights and allowing governments to implement laws with broader social goals. It highlights that equality under the Charter doesn't always mean identical treatment for everyone, but rather fair and reasonable treatment in context. The decision also underscores the role of Section 1 in recognizing that some limits on rights can be justified when pursuing important objectives. For anyone interested in Canadian constitutional law, insurance law, or the practical application of equality rights, Miron v. Trudel remains a foundational case. It reminds us that laws must be carefully crafted to respect individual rights while addressing the realities and needs of society as a whole. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into a landmark Canadian legal decision. Until then, take care.